We're going to talk about some of the processes and some of the different types of development applications, starting with defining who a developer is, talking about some of the detail that's required, the different types, about the process, and very briefly about appeals. So just to begin with, remember that when you're looking under a planning scheme, or have a look now if this is new to you, to check part 5 and 6 of the planning scheme, because you might be looking up an activity or a use that is exempt. So this particular screenshot is out of the administration, so part B, part 5 of the Hobart Interim Planning Scheme, and you can see that under a fair way down, if you scroll down, you'll get to table 5.5, and you'll see that there's a bunch of renewable energy exemptions. 5.5.1, ground mounted solar energy is exempt so long as it's not more than 80 meters squared, it's not relating to historic heritage values, etc. So you can see roof mounted solar, wind turbines. So it is good to check this. This is where beekeeping comes in as being exempt, just to make sure that you don't go barreling down the wrong process. And also remember, or have a look in the planning scheme, open up, for example, the general residential zone. This is the Hobart Interim Planning Scheme, and have a look at the use tables, because the use is in order from no permit required, permitted, discretionary, prohibited. So no planning permits are generally required if it's a residential use in a residential zone, if it's agricultural activity in a rural zone. Common sense, but these are just things to be aware of as expert planners when people are coming to advice about, well, can I do this? Do I need a planning permit to do this? So you can see under 10.2 use table here, there are 5 use classes here. So if you want to run home-based childcare centre in a general residential zone, and as long as it fits certain specifications, you don't need a permit. A passive recreation, residential, so I mean, this is kind of common sense. You don't need a permit to occupy a residential house in a residential zone, but I guess the planning scheme is important for spelling out what doesn't need a permit, and then what are kind of slightly larger uses where maybe you've got an employee coming to your home-based business. So the idea is that the planning scheme defines quite explicitly what it doesn't require permit, and then kind of broadening out from there. So this is what anybody who has worked on a local government council desk will tell you, that people will come up to the desk and very often say, I'm not a developer, but I want to do this. I want to change the use. I want to build a shed. And for the purposes of planning legislation, everybody's a developer if they're looking to change the use or to somehow change the property. So a developer is anybody who's undertaking a development, whether it's big or small. So this is advice from somebody who spent 10 years behind the planning desk at Clarence City Council, Dan Marr, who's been really important in this unit in terms of developing all of the material, and these are mostly, at least the basis of these are his slides. So his advice is, if you are coming in, is to be really positive about your interactions with the planners, particularly if perhaps you are moving into a consulting role or you've got repeat business. It's important not to be antagonistic. You know, if you're not getting your way or it's seeming very complicated, obviously it would be quite easy, and this does happen to council planners all the time, where people get really cross at them. They're the ones providing advice on the planning scheme. They're not trying to be mean to you on purpose. So for his advice, both as a consultant and as somebody who used to be on the council side of the desk, is to come in well informed, understand what you need to ask, find out who needs to answer them. The person who's actually assessing your application once all the paperwork goes in might not be the person that you talk to on the desk. So yeah, be patient, particularly for larger projects. So this is where establishing relationships definitely pays off. And usually for larger projects, you wouldn't throw the paperwork at council without some initial meetings to introduce yourself, the project, and just to check, to verify that your approach to gathering all the paperwork is consistent with what they're expecting. To find out whether council want to have an ongoing discussion about this, or perhaps council just want you to throw the paperwork in. And so maybe one meeting's enough, but maybe if you've got a really big and complicated project, you might have many meetings to brief them on the application, to check documentation, so that when it actually gets submitted, then you don't have significant problems. So in 2021, this is where following the Mount Wellington cable car is interesting, because there have been lots of hiccups along the way. This is a large and complicated project. The development application went into council, and since then it has been quite a bumpy road. There have been numerous requests for further information that have really slowed down the whole assessment. So another important thing is to remember that you might be talking to more than council. So TasWater, TasNetworks, Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania, State Growth, there's a number of what we're calling service authorities that might need to be involved early in the conversation. So the nitty-gritty of putting in an application. Applications need to be, these are my highlights on Dan's wording, sufficiently detailed to explain what's being proposed and address all likely impacts. Sufficiently detailed is a little bit hard to be prescriptive about, because it does depend on the size of the development and the complexity of the development. So if it's pretty simple, in the case below, this is a recent example that I looked up under current applications under City of Hobart. It's a swimming pool, and so the plans consist of hand annotated additions to the building plans that were previously approved. So rather than coming up with a set of plans from scratch, or even going back to the architect or the draftsman who's done the plans, the owner has simply hand drawn on the plans, scanned them and submitted them. There's a certificate of title, the plans, it's all pretty straightforward. Not a lot of detail, but enough for both the person in council and for anybody looking at this this advertised application to figure out what is being proposed. So it is important to consider who the audience is, and maybe there's more than one audience. So obviously, even in this simple example, there are two. There's the council planner, and there's also the neighbours and people who might care to write in a representation about this. So the audience in the case of the council planner is incredibly expert. They know their own planning scheme back to front. They know all the planning lingo. They know how to read plans. But in the case of an advertised application like this, there might need to be a bit more transparency or clarity, because if your neighbours need to understand what you're doing and they're not expert at reading plans, then a quite technical application could be a bit of a problem. So again, we'll come back to the Mount Wellington cable car, because it is a really good example of a complicated application that has already had many delays, pretty much every step of the way, including right at the very get-go, had a lot of problems getting landowner consent. So consent from, in this case, the City of Hobart, who needed to give permission for the application, at least the base, at the summit, if not all the way up, it took a while to get that approval. So yeah, a complicated application. There's a lot of documentation. There's its own web page. Mount Wellington Cable Car companies have had various pre-COVID public displays where you could go and talk to people. So they have put a lot of effort into that public outreach. They're quite often in the paper. So it's an example of quite a lot of shiny PR, as well as the main report, all the technical studies, threatened species report, or natural values reports. But still, around Aboriginal heritage in particular, there's been quite a delay. So, yeah, so I guess there's a couple of different strategies here. You can put your paperwork in not being sure whether it's sufficient and letting council work it out and come back to you with a formal request for further information, or you can have that dialogue and trying to get it all sorted before you put in the application. So yeah, so if you actually have a look, just Google Mount Wellington Cable Car Company. In this case, I put in delay, and this came up. This is from January 17th, 2020. The company needed to provide more information. Oh, I can't remember what exactly was asked for, but I think at the moment it's Aboriginal heritage that's lacking. So this has been an ongoing saga. So by now you should be familiar with a few different application types and processes. And if we start on the left with the primary permits and then go on to the right, secondary permits. So there are a bunch of things that should sound familiar to you by now on the left, even if those on the right don't sound familiar. So primary permits include those that you might need from the Commonwealth. So hopefully by now, where you see EPBC, you know what it means. This is the Commonwealth Environmental and Planning legislation, and depending on what's involved, you might be triggering a matter of national environmental significance, in which case you would refer it and the Commonwealth Minister would decide whether they need to take a closer look and do an assessment. We haven't talked much about projects of state significance because they don't happen very often. They're huge, incredibly expensive for the proponent to do, but the pulp mill is one example of a POS, project of state significance, that got a lot of attention not that long ago, I guess a few years ago. I'm pretty sure all of the permits would have lapsed quite some time ago now. This third dot point is about PAWS, projects of regional significance, which was meant to be kind of the next step down from a really huge statewide project. But the process has never been used. So there's never been an application of a project of regional significance. It's very costly, it's very complicated. And yeah, so the fact that nobody in all of the years of projects of regional significance being a pathway, a planning pathway, nobody's ever used it, and it's being replaced by the major project. So I mention this because some of you will be well aware of the major projects part of land use planning approvals that came in last year. There was quite a lot of concern about it, partly because of the cable car. Some people were really worried that what the major projects amendments to Land Use Planning and Approvals Act, it would mean that a big project like the cable car could be shifted into this different pathway that would mean that it would have an easier time of getting approved than where it currently sits with the City of Hobart. This is also the place to talk about the Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act, because there are occasions when a planning application will trigger environmental processes, And so this is, if you've done environmental impact assessment, this is a whole unit that we do to talk about how MCA works and what are level 2 activities and what the process is. So it's not covered in this unit, but it would be remiss of me not to point out that level 2 activities and that particular act and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Authority, are really important part of the planning process. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but just to flag it here in talking about primary permits. You will become quite familiar with a planning scheme amendment because a rezoning application is a planning scheme amendment, and it can be done in combination with a development application. So you might have a parcel of land, the zone is wrong for what you want to do. You can ask for a rezoning at the same time as you put in your development application. And good old DAs, this is most of what we're talking about. So when we're looking at small examples of sheds and pools and buildings and extensions, we're talking about a standard development application. So this is from the state government's webpage. They, when they started planning to move to a statewide planning scheme, there was a planning reform task force and a planningreform.tas.gov.au page set up, and it has quite a bit of information. It's quite dry on the whole, like not terribly easy to read probably if you're new to planning, but they do have some really great information there and some good visuals. So I've pinched this from their page. I like it because it gives these scales from your application for a shed down in the bottom left, where it's a very run-of-the-mill planning permit. It doesn't really affect anybody. It's just a very standard development application, through to very big projects that have statewide impacts, and this is where your POSs come in, projects of state significance. And then in the middle, you have what is new, only came through 2020, the major projects assessment process under Land Use Planning Approvals Act. Alongside that, you've got major infrastructure development approvals, which is mostly for linear infrastructure like transmission lines, where you might be going across 3 or 4 local government areas, and rather than putting in 4 different applications, you can go through this different process. Anyway, I don't want to clutter up your brain with a whole lot of other things, but this main axis from the local development application through to major projects and POSs is the main thing to know about, and almost all of what we're doing in the unit sits down at that bottom corner. This is where the work is in planning, and as graduate planners, that's mostly what you need to know about. But I do hope that you keep an eye on the news, and major projects is definitely something that comes up in the news. So this is the first project to be declared a major project. It's the Bridgewater Bridge. Late 2020 it was declared, and there are really good reasons for this going into a major projects pathway, because it is complicated. There are a couple of different councils involved, as well as the actual river, like quite a bit of planning complexity here. So being able to pull all of this complexity into a major project stream, I don't think in this case is terribly controversial. This is nothing like the cable car in terms of people being concerned about using this pathway to assess this project. It hasn't, as far as I know, got all that far yet, but something to keep an eye on because it is in the pipeline. Okay, so we've talked about those main application types that most are very standard development applications for small projects. But even with small projects, you do need to keep an eye on other permits that might be required. So even like some of the work that I did for North Barker when I was doing planning work for them, doing weed and threatened species surveys, even in very modest developments in places that had a bit of bush on the property, you would often need a threatened species permit. So it's not that these are rare, they're just other things to be aware of. Heritage works, Aboriginal relics, quite common. So not that, one is standard and one is uncommon, but just to be aware that there's all these other processes. Dam works, threatened species, forest activities have their own different planning pathway. A lot to be said about that, but we will skip over it for the sake of simplicity. Aboriginal Heritage Act permits required, maybe other heritage permits. So it just needs to be on your radar. In fact, councils often have, I do have a couple of examples that I think are in the webpage somewhere, but probably not yet, where they've got a checklist just to skim their eye down, to be reminded to think about all of these things when they're going through a development application, just to make sure that all the bases are covered. If you have done or are going to do environmental impact assessment, you will get your head around this. Slightly scary amount of looking detail on this page, but this is the Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act. Basically, it's the controls on polluting activities. Level 1 being quite small, level 2 being the bulk of the work, and level 3 is where projects of state significance come in. So all POSs go through the EPA as well as the regular planning process. So I'm not going to go through this except to say that you do need to be aware that some development applications, and again, they might not be all that big, but because of their potential to pollute, the Environmental Protection Authority wants to take a look at it. And actually, in the case of a level 1, sometimes it's because it's controversial, so maybe not big and maybe not even a massive potential to pollute, but because it's quite controversial, the director of the EPA decides to take a look. So this is an example of the Midlands Water Scheme to give you an idea of a big project where basically every possible permit that you could get needed to be sought. So there needed to be a strategic assessment, a different type of assessment under the Commonwealth. There wasn't any direct matters of national environmental significance triggered, but there was potential for a grassland to be affected because of the irrigation coming to threatened lowland grasslands. So a strategic assessment was done because the developer didn't want to use the project's regional significance because it's costly and horrible. There were 3 different councils involved, so 3 different permits, 1 at level 2, 2 at level 1. There was various permits required under the Water Management Act, Historic Cultural Heritage Act, Threatened Species Permit was required, a Forest Practices Plan was required, AHT got involved because permits to destroy artefacts in a dam area was required. There was a reserve activity assessment needed because a protected area was involved. The list goes on. So this is where planners are worth their weight in gold, because how could any developer possibly pull all this together? A massive project, but a massive amount of planning that needed to go into this. So even on a small scale, you should be aware that you might need to, or the council might need to refer to other authorities. So if you're working for the developer, you might need to have the conversations with TasWater, with AHT, with the Policy and Conservation Advice Branch, which I know is the Threatened Species Unit, but that's not its current name, State Growth, TasNetworks. So other authorities, even in the case of quite modest development applications, might need to get involved. I don't think there's much point going into major projects at the moment. It's not something that you're going to tackle as a graduate planner, but as I said before, because it's in the news, I think it's worth knowing about. So I provide a few links for you to do a bit more reading. The whole process of pulling it out of council and using what's called a planning panel, a skills-based assessment panel. So the Tasmanian Planning Commission is trying to pull this onto neutral territory, out of local government politics, away from elected representatives, and having expert planners assess it in its entirety. So rather than letting different councils come up with different permits, it's all being pulled together. And it also includes, this is the fourth point, a no reasonable prospect test to help a proponent figure out at an early stage that their development really isn't a goer. So this is something that we'll follow, particularly if it comes up in the news during semester. I'm not sure whether he's shown you this before, but this is something that will start looking quite familiar, because it's the process of what happens once an application goes in and all of the time periods around that is part of the set of rules that in this case council needs to be working to. So some of you as graduates will work for council, even before you graduate will work for council, and these numbers will drive a lot of your work, either as a consultant or at council. So these are set and council needs to adhere to these, and if they can't and the developer doesn't agree to extensions, then council's in a bit of trouble. So this is where a lot of the stress of planning work comes, is in trying, particularly smaller councils that have a lot of applications, is just trying to keep these, adhere to all of these days, 14 days, advertising, yeah. So I include this partly because it's a segue into talking about appeals. So you can see the wider bars at the bottom here. After a decision is made, the proponent, well, actually anybody involved in the application, if you've written a letter, you have a right to appeal. 7 days from the decision, the proponent, let me just read this small print, has a right to appeal, and then there are ongoing time periods around lodging the appeal and how long the tribunal has to make a decision. So yeah, this is quite, I know it's quite complicated, but it's a very important figure in terms of how this all happens. This is not Tasmanian specific in its general sense, in that this is the way that planning applications work, no matter really which the jurisdiction. Maybe the times are different, but the flow is the same. We don't talk a whole lot in this unit about appeals. It is generally a matter for more experienced planner, although if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view, you might end up as an expert witness at an appeal quite soon after graduating. It is one of the more stressful things that a planner can do, appear before the tribunal, but something that's important for you to know about in terms of the actual flow of the planning process. So if anyone is crossed with the decision, and that could be the proponent, it could be somebody who's written a letter, a representation, they have the right to appeal the decision. So sometimes even in the case of the developer actually getting a permit, sometimes they want to appeal the conditions on that permit that they think are unreasonable, and so it goes to appeal and it gets heard afresh. So the tribunal hear the matter de novo afresh, and they make a decision in as the planning authority. So I think that's probably all I should say about that. And just to remind you down the bottom here, Jared, who is the Registrar of the Resource Management and Planning Appeal Tribunal, is the person who wrote the Guide to Statutory Land Use Planning in Tasmania. The link is under the key resources in Milo. And so this is from his information about the reason that he ends up seeing you in appeal, because maybe as an expert planner you have made mistakes, and this is some of the common errors that are made at the council side that land them in appeal, because the description of the property wasn't inadequate. The signs to let people know weren't adequate, so maybe people didn't know about it and it was council's fault that you didn't know about it. Maybe, yeah, they got the times wrong, maybe they failed to notify the adjoining landowner. It goes on. So part of the reason that Jared has invested a lot of time in this unit over the years is to try to make sure that you come out of this unit well informed in terms of what you can and can't do and what your responsibilities are. This statutory land use planning is essentially a legal unit, and so it's in his interests as an expert lawyer and as a planning lawyer that we're all up to scratch. So kind of a long video compared to some of them, but there was a lot to cover. Always good to finish with a cartoon. Here are all the different perspectives on planning processes and how clients and architects, engineers, the people who get involved in building all see the project. And so planning is fun and interesting because we are the people who bring these conversations together and try to make things clear, so that not only what gets built is what both the proponent and the community agreed to, but the process along the way of doing it isn't too fraught.